And we know history telling us that wherever bloodshed, sex, drugs, bitches, whores, and all of these types of things that you hear about in the sound wave, they know that that can sell. So if they can approach our children, our young men in our community and dangle the carrot of £1 million contract, £2 million contract, £100,000 worth of money, and you make this music in the studio for 5 minutes, and we can sell this and we can profit from this, and we together can make money. What they ignore is, again, the bloodshed that exists within the community, and people like myself have to pick up the pieces when an innocent child lives in that same community of where those narratives talk about those beefs, tensions, and conflict, and those children get caught up in the crossfire when they're just trying to make their way to school.
Audacious Rebel. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the path of the Audacious Rebel, where we challenge conventional thinking and explore transformative solutions to society's most pressing issues. Today, we're diving deep into realities of crime, violence, and the power of intervention. And to help us navigate this crucial discussion, I have the privilege of speaking with a man who has dedicated his life to understanding and addressing these challenges. Craig Pinkney is a criminologist, urban youth specialist, and one of the UK's leading voices on gangs, youth violence, and criminal exploitation. With years of experience in frontline intervention, academic research, and policy development, he has worked tirelessly to disrupt cycles of violence, offering real solutions rooted in education, mentorship, and social reform. Craig is the founder of SOLVE, the Center for Youth Violence and Conflict, a lecturer and an international speaker whose insights are shaping the way communities, law enforcement, and policymakers approach crime. His work is not just about addressing crime and its transforming lives. Today, we'll be discussing the root causes of youth violence, the role of trauma, systemic issues, and how real change can be achieved. Craig, welcome to the path of the Audacious Rebel. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me, brother.
You know, I've been looking at your profiles, following your work on YouTube. I'm saying, when does this man has the time to do all this? And then he don't look that old either, you know? He's young.
Yeah.
Craig, you've dedicated over 2 decades to addressing youth violence and gang culture. Mm-hmm. Can you share what initially drew you to this field and how your journey has evolved over the years?
It's a number of things. I come from a very strong family that moved here from the Caribbean and were quite instrumental in the community that I'm from in Birmingham, the UK. And they were very much community activists, community leaders, and started a series of movements within the community. And I guess I was born into a family of activists. So when people always say to me, you know, where did it start? I have to give props to my grandparents and the struggles, the commitment, the passion, and the willingness to want to ensure that our people had the best opportunities possible. And I guess as a young man, like many, struggled within the education system, left secondary school or high school with no qualifications. I was a bit of a bad boy at one point. And volunteering in my local community was one of the things that I started doing under the realm of sport. I used to play basketball in my younger days, and basketball coaching was my first kind of introduction to working with children. And I guess what I started to notice was, even though I was coaching, I was experiencing children coming from different backgrounds and understanding that their parents had loads of issues going on at home. So it was more than just being a coach. It was also being an advocate. It was also being an advisor. It was also being the big brother. To some of them, it was also being the uncle. And I kind of started to enjoy being in this particular space. And then I made the decision to kind of further my learning in the area of youth work, because I had a series of mentors in my life at the time saying that you'd be a good youth worker. And I thought youth work is not really for me. And then they told me the numbers and how much youth workers get paid here in the UK. And I was like, you know what? Maybe this youth work thing is for me. So it's interesting how I gave you that kind of that foundation of where I was coming from, but I didn't really pay attention to that until I then decided to go to university and do an undergrad in youth and community studies. And when I graduated from university, it's funny because I remember my mother crying, and it was weird for me because the reason why she was crying is because how proud she was of me. But my memory of my mother crying is every time she got called to school or to college when I had been in a fight or I'd done something wrong. So seeing her cry for something positive was something that threw me
Wow.
out. I don't know why, but that always stays in my memory. So then my first opportunity leaving university was managing a local youth provision in my community. And well, I started off as a senior worker and then I was a manager for a period of time. And it was in that particular space that really kind of got my curiosity around what was going on with these young black men that I was working with, many of which had went on to exploit, extort, harm, murder other young people in my community. And I guess that was my curiosity to understand the why. So then I decided to do a master's degree in criminology, specializing in the area of gangs and serious violence as it relates to young black men and looking at what does it take in order for them to desist and deter them away from those particular behaviors. And my early studies was of senior members of a particular group that I grew up around when I was growing up. So I guess what we would call them our elders. Those individuals, I utilized their case studies to make sense of what was going on in my local community. And then I went into more the academic space where I wanted to kind of conduct and engage in more research. I was delivering lectures. I was on a number of programs within the university. And time goes really quick because I was there for about 9 years. And whilst I was there, I had the blessed opportunity to work around Europe. I had a blessed opportunity to work with the Ministry of Justice in Jamaica. And I was on a number of programs around the Caribbean where we were upskilling professionals to be able to work in a range of different environments. And then that led me to my PhD, where in 2015, Birmingham, UK was dubbed as the gun crime capital of the country. And I guess I was asking the question, why? What was going on in that particular time in my community? And at that particular time, we got hit with a new genre of music in the UK known as drill music.
Definitely.
And for those that are very aware of that in south side of Chicago, and then became a big thing in New York, that then came to Europe in different parts of Sweden and Poland and Northern Ireland, and the UK, London first, and then Birmingham, and took set with that. And in 2015, this particular sound was really interesting because it was a shift from generic hip hop of what we were hearing. And this type of sound was more talking about gang violence, murder, and bloodshed, getting people back. And I argue that those particular songs that came out from a number of young men that I was working with exacerbated a number of shootings within the community. So my PhD looks at that along with the young men that I was working with in my community center at that time, up until 2025, looking at every single shooting or homicide that's taken place to make the links between where guns are coming from in terms of Eastern Europe and how they get to the UK, because we know they're legal here in the UK, and how they get into the hands of organized criminals and how they go then to middlemen and how they get to urban street gangs, into a time now where we're seeing 13 and 14-year-old children becoming paralyzed and getting shot, and some of them losing their lives, many of which are also innocent in some of the violence between some of the groups within the area that I grew up and some of the areas that I do a lot of work in.
You've said a lot, and I'm glad you mentioned that factor where music, drill music, because that's also a big issue right now in the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad. But I want to go back a bit. In your experience, what or do you consider to be the primary root causes of youth violence in urban settings?
It's interesting because I think the way in which we ask the question We sometimes look for one answer, and I argue that it's multifaceted. There's a number of reasons: poverty, deprivation, mental health, intergenerational trauma, reactive interventions from individuals that are passionate about wanting to work within community but actually don't have the competency to work, fear, perceived notions of fear, gentrification, where we're now seeing big business coming to communities and removing poor people out of those particular areas, and then they're dumping these communities in other areas and environments and leaving them all in one particular small, tight environment. Lack of police presence, the cuts within services to do with children, young people, social services, youth offending, probation, housing, lack of housing within community, the increase in drugs and alcoholism, the increase in suicide ideation. So as you can see, there's a number of factors that play here, and mentioning things like the impact of COVID-19. As a nation, we haven't dealt with the impact and the ripple effect of COVID. Social media that I've just mentioned. And also one of the things that's becoming apparent within the research, what we talk about here is neurodivergence. So we're talking about children and young people that may be on the spectrum of autism, children and young people that have ADHD, attention deficit, or ADD, that I know that some of our brothers in different parts of the world we're more familiar with, and how children and young people become fixated with wanting to carry knives, wanting to carry weapons, guns, why children and young people become fixated because of their neurodivergent to want to be part of particular groups. So there are multiple reasons within the urban space of why individuals get themselves involved in these particular things. And what I get people to do is look at things from a intersectional multiple lens that will enable us to think about better ways that we can engage children and young people that may be impacted by the issues that we're worried and concerned about.
You know, you've researched the impact of social media, you just mentioned it again, and music on youth violence. Presently in Trinidad, you have this new music, Zest, or what they call Trinibad. And there is this incessant debate as to the impact of this music as it pertains to gangs and gang violence. But what these people, the artists, are saying, they are simply reflecting or identifying their experience. It's not something they generally want to perpetuate, but this is what they are experiencing. How do you identify the impact of this type of music, and how does it influence the gang dynamics?
I love that you gave that, because here in the UK, the artists say the exact same thing. And I think it's important that when we're having these conversations, artists, makers, creators of art also have to hold accountability, just like members of the community have to hold accountability, like the education system, like the criminal justice system, like the social services, and so on and so forth, and the government in totality. Artists have to play, and they play a very significant role in shaping the way in which our children and young people think. So they're role models, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they want to accept the idea of being a role model. And whilst they may be talking about their lifestyles, talking about the way in which they see the world, what they also have to understand is that you have very young, impressionable young people, number one. You've also got young people that are involved in beefs and tensions that are also listening to this music. So if an artist makes this argument to say they're making this music because they want to get out of the hood, they want to get out of their environment, they want to get out of their community, and they're doing it because they want to enable themselves to make money and support their families, so on and so forth. Where accountability comes in is that the narratives and the things that they talk about can exacerbate beefs and conflicts within the community. So, for example, if an artist is saying that I'm from this block, I'm from this street, I'm from this particular environment, and we've got beef with such and such, if that individual decides to make this music and they get a blessed opportunity to go to America, to go to different parts of the world. Whilst they do that, the narrative of the beef of what they're talking about remains within the environment of what they're talking about. So when you have parties and individuals that are upholding those beefs and tensions, and individuals are getting shot, individuals are getting stabbed, individuals are dying based on these particular narratives, that individual most definitely can enjoy the spoils of what they make from their music, but the disease of bloodshed still exists within the community. And I say that's no different to drug dealers that also argue that they do these things in order to get out of their environment to enable themselves to get a better opportunity or better shot at life. But the product that they're selling destroys the community, and the ripple effect of the disease in which they spread within the community is something that we can't ignore. So, of course, when we're talking to these young men, I argue it's a double-edged sword, because we have to also understand that there is a financial gain of making this music. So I don't also just blame the artists. I also talk about corporate organizations and institutions that also benefit and profit from this. And we know history telling us that wherever bloodshed, sex, drugs, bitches, whores, and all of these types of things that you hear about in the sound wave, they know that that can sell. So if they can approach our children, our young men in our community and dangle the carrot of £1 million contract, £2 million contract, £100,000 worth of money, and you make this music in the studio for 5 minutes, and we can sell this and we can profit from this, and we together can make money, what they ignore is, again, the bloodshed that exists within the community. And people like myself have to pick up the pieces when an innocent child lives in that same community of where those narratives talk about those beefs, tensions, and conflict. And those children get caught up in the crossfire when they're just trying to make their way to school. That part we can't ignore. So accountability is not just for those that make the music, but also for those labels that come into our communities and dangle this golden ticket to tell our young men that making this music is profitable, whilst they destroy their communities, but they use that money to uphold their own.
So you think music labels then should have some sort of accountability, but is there any mechanism in place to ensure that there's accountability where that is concerned? Because sometimes I wonder if that is deliberate. Because I mean, even look at social media. If I post some positive quote or something, it's not going to go viral. But if it's
Yes.
something ridiculous, I mean, in a minute, that's all over the world, and everybody's going to comment and say something about it. So it's a sort of reciprocal thing. And just recently, I had this discussion with someone in the media as well, because we're talking about this, that the media print a lot of negative headlines, sensationalizes for it to sell. But the thing is, if that is what the society is clamoring for, then is the media giving what society wants? How does it out?
And it's hard because what we're fighting here is capitalism, ultimately. We're talking about a capitalist society of
Yes.
which is about financial gain.
Yes.
So whilst we're having the conversations around this, what we're having, brother, is a conversation more about morals and principles, and we're talking about the moral tipping point of our community that is warfare on all levels, spiritually, emotionally,
Hmm.
and these things impact our communities, but then capitalism is designed to destroy all of that. So whilst we have these conversations and morally we're like, you know what, it makes better sense, I would also know that
Hmm.
our people watching this saying, listen, we ain't trying to hear what these people are saying,
Yeah.
because we can get money from this.
Yes.
And like when I talk to young men in my community about these things, and I find it very difficult. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say this is an easy conversation. It's difficult. And I remember a young man saying to me once, he said, Craig, I either sell these drugs or I make this music. There is no third option for me.
Right.
And that's the challenge. Because what these young men that I work with are saying is, with their criminal records, with firearms and violence as it relates to gangs, nobody's going to give them an opportunity. So let's not have those conversations and suggest that you're going to get an opportunity. They understand that with the situation that they have and the options that they have available to them, selling drugs is an easy option. But they've also realized that they're talented and they're gifted, and they are, but their
Yes.
talents and their gifts are being used to solely benefit them as individuals, but then destroys their communities as the ripple effect.
When you are faced with a response like that from that young man, how do you respond?
It's difficult, and that's what I said. It's not easy. And I guess with that particular young man, all I can do is try to give better insight into the impact of what they say and what they do in those studios. But the battle is that you've got the record labels that only want them to talk about that one thing. And
Yes.
the one thing that they want them to talk about is the violence, is the bloodshed, is the beef, is the
Hmm.
conflict. So that's the double-edged sword. And I find it very hard when working with young men to try and get them to think a little bit different, because they know that that's what's required from them. But I guess one of the added things that we can do is, the reality is that some of the young guys that are going mainstream, it's not just violence that they're talking about, and it's about versatility. If they want to, I guess, develop their talent, it's about also understanding that talking about that one thing doesn't have to be the thing that they believe is what's going to make them money. And when you look at the artists that are going number one, they are versatile. They're not just talking about one particular thing. And I think a lot of our young men believe that in order to make it, they have to talk about that one thing, which is around the violence and the bloodshed. So it's difficult. It's not easy. I've never worked with a young man that I've found that the process has been easy. But I guess what I don't do is, when I initially meet them, I don't essentially put the barriers up, because I don't like the music and I generally have a perspective that it's demonic and it's
Right.
destroying our communities. I don't initially meet our young men on that energy. It's more about who are they, what are they
Right.
about, building a relationship. Let me hear one of your tracks, and then I'll put it back to them and say, try and tell me. Let's see how skillful you are, and let's see if you can do a track on, I don't know, climate
Positivity or
change. If you can do one on how much you love your mother, I want to see
right.
how skilled and talented you are. So I, when working with young men in education system, that's how we approach those young men. We allow them for the first couple of tracks to do what I say, speak their nonsense, and
Right.
then we test them and say, how versatile are you? Can you do a track without swearing?
Right.
Without cursing? Can you do a track talking about something else other than your area code, your postcode, your
Right.
environment? Can you show me how versatile you are? Why? Because if you are to go mainstream, these are the things that you're talking about. And what we don't do is allow them to just keep talking about that same thing that we know is potentially going to cause somebody being triggered, somebody feeling offended, somebody feeling disrespected, that equally then turns to even more violence within our community.
Understood. Understood. In your interview with The Guardian, you highlighted that young people caught up in gang violence are often traumatized and that policymakers need to prioritize their mental health. How does trauma manifest in the lives of young people involved in gangs, and what strategies are effective in addressing it?
I think the conversation about trauma is something that is interesting. And when you think about the lens or the lives of just young people generally, before we talk about gangs, you asked me a question earlier on, and I mentioned around poverty, deprivation,
Mhm.
mental health, lack of opportunity, lack of resources, housing. All of these are what is considered adverse experiences for any child. If you're growing up in poverty and you can't eat as frequently as you would love to, you're going to school and you don't have your full uniform, or you've only got one shirt, and your shoes have got holes in it. You're living in an environment where fear exists. You're
Right.
going to a school and your teachers don't really care for you. It's a racist environment that only wants to exclude you and suspend you. And you've got a community where the police are constantly targeting you. These are all traumatic experiences. So when we talk about children and then young people that find themselves in gangs, that's then exacerbated by communities that have beefs and conflicts with each other. Then we're talking about young men that may have watched or observed other young men get stabbed, get shot, and have had to witness and help and support their friends whilst they've gone to the hospital, they've gone to ICU, many of which have gone to funeral homes to bury their friends, and multiple friends have lost their lives in quite short period of time. Then you've got the older individuals that live in the community that tell them they need to get back, they need to continue and get back and avenge those that have lost. And it's just an environment of which is toxic. And those traumatic experiences, oftentimes, for many of our young men, puts them in environments and situations where they feel that they can't speak. And their anger and their frustration oftentimes plays out in a number of ways, not just violence, because oftentimes we talk about gang violence, but also about we're talking about young people that are smoking weed, smoking cannabis. We're talking about young people that are taking other substances, popping pills, drinking lean. We're talking about young men that are turning to alcohol and sometimes a concoction of a bit of everything. And then we're also talking about young men predominantly that are engaging in what I call over-sexualized behaviors, multiple partners, and engaging with these things. And then the question is, why are they doing this? And they're doing this because they, one, don't have that opportunity to vent. We don't think about how much the need is for our young men to get counseling, to get therapy. So when our young men don't have counseling, therapy, or spaces of which they can talk and can connect and to offload and to vent, we see that manifest in the behaviors that we see within our local communities. Wow. So we can't talk about violence but not talk about trauma. We can't talk about violence and we can't talk about strategies, how we're going to support and engage. So when you talk about effective interventions, the intervention that oftentimes effective oftentimes is around young men being in environments and spaces where they're able to be vulnerable. And a lot of our young men are not in spaces and environments where they're able to be vulnerable. So we have to create those environments. And secondly, we also have to be mindful of the labels in which we use. I know from the community that I come from, coming from the Caribbean, words like mental health is probably not the best word to use in the community. Why? Because some of our community, from a historical context, when the word mental health was used, it was used actually as an opportunity to push further injustice within community, because many activists within the community that was fighting against systems that was hell bent on destroying communities, those community leaders and activists that were fighting on behalf of civil rights, fighting on behalf of equity, equality, justice, it was said that they were mentally ill, and many of them were sectioned under the mental health and ended up in hospitals. And it was a process in order to silence those individuals. So when we talk about previously intergenerational trauma, we have to also acknowledge that as well, that the labels that we use within the current day oftentimes can have an adverse impact on our children and young people. So when working with young men, I don't use the word mental health. Sometimes it might just be wagwan, how you feeling, how you doing. And it's about how do we start to think about creating spaces for our young men to talk and them to be vulnerable. And I'll give you one example, a young man that we were working with and is one of my biggest success stories. And he now is actually a youth worker in our community. And he said to me 2 weeks ago, he says, Craig, I believe that I've got post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, what do you mean? He said, I was just in the gym working out. And he said, there was another black man that was just looking at me in the gym through the mirror. And he said, my paranoia kicked in. And all I was thinking is I need to pick up a weight and smash him around his head because I don't know why he's looking at me. And bearing in mind, he's transitioned, not a gang member no more. He's living quite a normal life, but yet still these traumas, because I don't know who you are. I don't know why you're looking at me. And I said, could it be that the young man was just looking at another black brother and just thinking, you know what? He looks like he's somebody that's in shape. And he may be somebody that inspires me. But
Wow.
because of the mindset is
Yes.
negativity,
It's
you might be
conditioned.
up, you might be someone that's against me, you might be someone that's trying to kill me. So
Yes.
automatically his
The
mind went to
dread.
violence
Yes.
and he was questioning himself, Craig, why was I even thinking this in a gym? And I'm
Mm.
saying this is what's happening with a lot of our young brothers in the community that are actually trying to navigate through life. So you got to imagine our young men that are involved in gangs with all of these kind of adverse experiences they've had from childhood. You can understand why when you look at them and you stand on their sneakers, you knock them or you're looking at them too long or there's some form of disrespect that takes place physically or online, why they go from from 0 to 1,000,
Yeah.
because that's all they know. And those are
And
the
it's something.
responses from trauma.
And it's something too, because I mean, when you study the work of people like Chad Posdick and Adrian Rain and whatnot, they're showing the biological factors so that when a woman is pregnant and she's in a stressful situation, that child will develop a more developed hindbrain rather than the frontal lobe, that executive function. So it's a more impulsive child. So now you're seeing the sociology is becoming the biology. So it's
Yes,
more than just social policies now.
yes,
This is getting even more and more entrenched as we move along. So that's a lot. That's a lot you spoke there. Just remind me too. I was having a conversation. I told you I work in corrections, and I was having a conversation one day in prison with this young man. He was inside for a few murders. And we really had some nice conversations when I come to work. As a matter of fact, I used to bring some books for him to read and stuff. And he said, Mr. Marshall, I wish I could leave this life. I said, but you can. He said, no. If I try to, I would be murdered. How can you help somebody like this? He wants to. He wish he can. But he thinks if he does, it would lead to his demise.
yeah. There's a concept that I talk about in my research, and something that I'm making sense of within my PhD, and I'm glad you've asked this question. And I call it phasing out. And one of the things that I'm talking about in this particular chapter that I'm writing is that when you meet young men that are at the harsher end of violence, I'm not just talking about the kids that are hanging around and have been involved in a couple of things. I'm talking the ones that have shot and stabbed, maimed, and potentially even killed people, but they want out. I argue that we have to take them through a process of which, and that's exactly what it says, phasing them out stage by stage. So, for example, like the young man that I just mentioned, prime example, first thing is that he needs to move out of the community. That's the
Mm.
first stage. No matter how much they think that changing their lives is going to have an impact, they need to leave the community. Why? Because the groupings of individuals, both friendship groups and also ups or opposition that they may have, still exist within that environment. So they need to move.
Right.
One of the other things that they need to do is also figure out a way in which they can become vulnerable enough to accept that they possibly need to speak to someone, whether that is the word counseling, whether you want to use the word therapy, whether you want to use the word, supporting someone's well-being, whatever that may be, willing to be able to do that. But in terms of the friendship groups, and this is the most important part, is not to sever ties with your friends. And I know this sounds quite contentious, but just let me explain why. Because if you, as an individual, severs a relationship with the group of individuals that you've lived a long time with and you've engaged in all types of activities, if you just sever that relationship, what that can oftentimes do from the individuals that feel that they've been disconnected from you is use that as an opportunity to attack you.
Yes.
Because they may look at it as, who do you now think you are? Because
Yes.
you've moved out of the environment, you've moved out of the area, you now somewhat think you're better than us. So I say, don't sever the relationship. keep the relationship, but then think of a way of which you're going to remove yourself from activities. And let's say over a 7-day week, let's try and get it to 6 days, 5 days, 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, and 1 day. Now, the question is, well, what would that be over that 7 days? Well, one of the things for the young man that I was mentioning, he now works part time. So whether he was hanging around with his boys for 7 days, there's 3 days now where he's not going to be hanging around because he's at work.
Right.
Now he's got a daughter. So there's a couple of days now where he needs to make sure whilst his partner's at work, 2 days, he needs to make sure that he's looking after his daughter. Now that remains 2 days left. Now what happens with the group of friends that are connected? They also see that you've left, you've transitioned. Now the brother's got work. Now the brother's got a daughter. The way in which they internalize that relationship is going to be very different to you just severing the relationship with no actual reason of why you've left, other than you're just saying you need to get out. So what we're talking about here is interpersonal relationships. And how does an individual sever a relationship in a safe way that's also going to ensure that he's safe and also those particular groups? And one of the things that I found from my research is that when you phase people out like that, you tend to find that the group that the individual is disconnected from actually has more respect for the individual as opposed to just cutting ties.
Understand.
And then on the flip side, I've known of individuals that have just severed ties with that group. And then what happens is they get labeled as being a snitch. They get labeled as somebody that's moving a little bit weird. Are they working with the government? Are they working with the authorities? And then what happens then is the young boys then use that as an opportunity to then want to take your possessions or hurt and harm you for whatever reason.
Right. You know, community involvement is central to your work. Can you discuss the role of community led initiatives in violent reduction and how they differ from the top down approach?
Community approaches are oftentimes seen as interventions where you have a bunch of leaders that talk a lot but don't know what they're doing. And when you think of the realm of public health, you may remember in 2017 and 18, the World Health Organization said that gang violence is a public health issue.
Yes.
And in order for us to respond to gang violence as it's a public health issue, we as collectives need to see and seek the underlying factors that cause children and young people to engage in particular behaviors, of which may cause homicide, fatality, and so on and so forth. So when you look at any public health approach, and if you just look around the world, whether you want to look at Chicago, if you want to look at New York, you want to look at South Africa, you want to look at places that have adopted a public health approach, they've all understood that these approaches need to be community-led but academically driven. And that means we need insights from those environments, from those particular spaces that will enable us to have a best shot at being able to respond to particular issues. So this is where community becomes important, because community are the body of which most of these young people come from, most of these children come from. Every young man that we know of that's involved in gangs, the girls that may be involved in gangs, come from a household, whether that is parents, whether that is grandparents, whether that is foster carers, whether that is children's services, whatever that may, they're coming from a household. And whether that household or not has love within it, there is a community that also sits around those households. So those members of the community are really important, and it's about how do we identify those within the community that can help with this particular cause. So if we look at Chicago's Operation Ceasefire as an example, what they understood was that within community, you're going to need tiers of individuals that are able to respond to different issues. So you've got the wider community where there needs to be messages and interventions, working with them about how do we reduce violence. Then you've got another level of young people that may be on the periphery of these particular issues. But there's also then a category of individuals that are supposed to work directly with those that pull triggers, that incite violence, and how do we engage with those people? Because one of the biggest frustrations that I have, especially here in the UK, is that loads of people are saying that they're working with gangs, but not many people are working with the individuals that are shooting and stabbing people every
Right.
single day. And I argue that members of the community that are possibly, known historically for the wrong thing, I
Yes.
believe it's about how do we help those young men to transform their lives that also, remember we were talking about phasing out, that still
Yes.
had those connections, that if a gun goes off or someone gets shot in our community, that those individuals are able to go to their brothers, go to their friendship groups and say, listen, we don't want no more reprisals. You need to put the gun down.
Yeah.
The local authority can't do that. Those
Yeah.
that work with
You see,
can't do
they
that.
have walked the path. You see, as I said, it's only those who have walked the path can actually lead. So they
But
know.
it's
They
about
know.
also, and one of the things I'll add is about upskilling those individuals,
Right.
because there's also a danger. And one of the things I also talk about in my work is that people just believe that those individuals that have walked the path are the only individuals to engage. I argue on top of that is that those individuals need to be trained.
Yes.
They need to be trained in
Yes.
order to be able to respond. And when I talk about training, I'm not just talking about, having an understanding of the environment, but I'm talking about emotional intelligence. I'm talking about being trauma informed in your approach, talking about understanding things like counseling and therapy, understanding things like mediation, understanding how do you get a young man from A to B at a moment when he's heightened and he just wants to hit the road and do something. How do you get that young man from A to B to C to D? Because it's not just about talking about when you was a bad man in the early 2000s and you went to prison. That story is not enough. So my
Right.
added part to that is, yes, we need young men and women that have walked the path, but they need to be trained. And that's why when we look at Chicago's approach, when we think about Operation Ceasefire, that's what they did. They trained those individuals to a standard, to a point where it didn't sever their connections, but it also meant that the police and the local authorities needed to trust the community intervention. And you and I know the biggest hindrance to any community intervention around reduction of violence in all forms is trust that the authorities give to community, because I don't believe that they respect them the same. They want them to give all of the information about what's going on in the streets.
Yes.
They then don't want to give them resources in order to enable them to do the one thing that everybody wants as a collective, is reduce the bloodshed, reduce the violence, and have peace within our community.
Indeed. From your perspective, Craig, what policy changes you think are crucial for effectively addressing youth violence and supporting rehabilitation?
I think the policy change needs to be one that really is rooted in public health. Most of our policies mention public health, but we don't follow the public health methodology. Most of it is still founded upon what I call a criminal justice response, meaning, in layman terms, something happens, a child dies in the community, and then local authority get funding from local or national government that then rolls out to engage in, for example, outreach work in a particular geographical space where violence may be an issue. Whereas I argue if you take a public health approach, it seeks to work with children from the age of kindergarten or nursery all the way up to adulthood. Problem is that most of our policies attack and engage the issue from when our young people are like 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. And I argue that's too late. We need to
Yes.
be working with children from the age of 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm not saying that we need to go in and talk about gang violence, but we can talk about healthy relationships. We can talk about how young people can open up and speak, and how they can connect to their mental well-being. How can they build on positive relationships? How do we enable young people to become entrepreneurs? How can we enable young people within our community to not just want to be entertainers, want to be sports people? We have to start thinking about ways in which we can engage our young people at the earliest point possible. And I think those policies around public health need to be of which engages in what I call a program and a process that thinks beyond just 18 months and 24 months, but thinks 10 to 15 years. And that's also the problem, that most of our commissioning and most of our funding generally is between 1 to 3 years. So what happens is you may start to see some amazing declines in terms of criminality, decline in terms of particular behaviors. It looks like everything is going right, and then they move the funding and redirect it. When really we need to start to pump into those particular activities in terms of a longer process. And that's what a public health approach does.
Based on what you're saying, what I'm also thinking is there should be some sort of the whole academic structure, the education system, should include some sort of training that is more than just academic.
100%. And
Yeah,
that's
so
why I talk about the link between, you know, bridging the gap between academia and the streets.
right.
There needs to be that kind of connection. And that's what I always say as my strap line. That's what I'm all about. Bringing academia to the streets. How do we connect that? And that's why I call myself the street academic, because it's not just about me sitting and as an academic person, sitting in my ivory tower, looking down on society and making up all of these theories and all of these ideas and models. If I'm not able to go down to the ground floor and walk within my community and connect with the people and eat in the same food places of where my people are. And I always argue if an academic can't do that, then it makes me question whatever they're writing or whatever policy that they're trying to change. Does it have the lens and the ears and the thoughts and the minds of the people that we're out there to support? And it is about how do we bridge that gap. So I work a lot within that academic space to challenge academics about that, but equally within the streets, within the community, I also say many of us need to leave the nest and go into different fibers within the system that we're able to have impact and dismantle things accordingly.
Now, Craig, looking ahead, what emerging challenges do you foresee in the realm of youth violence? What advice would you offer to practitioners and policymakers aiming to make a difference?
I think the best place is to discover your lane. There's so much work to do. There's so many environments and there's so many contexts in which we can make change. And when I first started this work, I had what is called a savior complex. I genuinely believed that I could save all of the young men that I was working with. And it was only until I started to experience many of them, as I said in the beginning, taking the lives of other young men and being incarcerated for selling drugs within our community, that I shifted what is called my positionality. And my positionality went from stopping gang violence to reducing gang violence. And I know I'm able to reduce. So when you ask me that question, when I talk about discovering your lane, it's about identifying what is the one or two things that you are capable to do that's also realistic, that you are able to make change. So I know education for me is the best space. So I develop a series of programs, projects, whether that is designed for professionals, designed for the community, or designed for young people. And those particular programs, one, either help to understand, to motivate, to inspire, to deter individuals from a particular behavior, to then inspire those from the community, those community leaders to understand what that public health approach looks like. And then for those young men and young women that we work with, to get them to think beyond just the stereotypical things that are given to us. So education is my lane. So discovering your lane becomes really important. understanding your lane, and then just driving. And then finding individuals on your journey that you're able then to interconnect with their journeys and then make that connect as one. So we work
Wow.
with organizations in mental health. We work with organizations that do sports. We work with organizations in faith and spiritual settings. We
Right.
work with organizations that are in the prisons. We work with organizations that are in children or social services. And we understand everybody's lane, but it's about how do we come together holistically to
Right.
support each other.
That's the same word I was just thinking. It's a holistic approach. You know, Craig, this conversation has been incredibly insightful. We've covered the root causes of youth violence, the role of trauma, the impact of social media and music. We've looked at the importance of community led interventions. One thing that stands out, though, is your emphasis on understanding the lived experience of young people and addressing systemic issues rather than just reacting to the
Yes.
symptoms of crime. Before we close, though, if there's one message you want to leave with our listeners, whether they're policymakers, community leaders, parents, or young people themselves, what would it be?
Let's not sit waiting for one of our own children to lose their life. I meet people every day that at once upon a time, they would have never imagined that their own children would have been caught up in some of the things that we're worried and we're concerned about. So my message is, let's not wait for our own children to get corrupted by this disease. And that means it's also a call to action. There is something that each and every one of us can do, whether that's donation, whether that is sharing of these types of messages and conversations, whether that is having conversations with your peers, your friends, having conversations with your own children, and find a way to support and uplift those within the community that are really trying to do the work. And I think that goes for all of us, whether you are a parent, whether you're a member of the community, whether you work for one of the authorities, whether you work within the government, whether you're a policymaker, each and every one of us have a role, not just selfishly, but because of humanity. Our work should be about humanity, justice, equality, equity, and justice. And if we can start to humanize the things that we're doing, then maybe, just maybe, our children's future will be very different to ours.
Wow. Craig, for those who want to learn more about your work, get involved, or support your initiatives, where can they find you?
They can find me on social media platforms. I have a website, my name, full name, craigpinkney.com. And you're able to find out some of the work that we're doing. For those that want to donate, you're able to go through one of our organization portals and support some of the work we're doing with young men around changing their lives within the community. I'm on Instagram, Craig Pinkney. I'm on LinkedIn, Craig Pinkney. I'm on X, or formerly known as Twitter. I'm all over the place. You type me on YouTube, I'm there. You know, I am just a human that's been given a gift by the Most High to serve my people. And if I can serve them in many ways, you know, it's there. And, you know, I'm waiting for the invitation
To
to
Trinidad?
come to the Trinidad.
No, and I want to
We
tell the
are our
audience,
family over there. So
I'll tell the audience, one thing I know, Craig responds because I messaged Craig on Instagram.
yeah, it's the best
And
way to
he
go.
he did respond. You know, Craig, I truly appreciate your time and the invaluable insight you've shared on this podcast today. Your work is making a real impact, and I know our audience will walk away from this conversation with a deeper understanding of these critical issues. Thank you for joining me on the part of the Audacious Rebel. And to everyone listening, if you found today's discussion valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, and share the episode. Let's continue the conversation and drop your thoughts in the comments or connect with us on social media. Until next time, stay audacious. Audacious Rebel.